All right, so Piper, I want to start with you. I think people probably feel pretty familiar with your life story, but only kind of in this small swath from the book and then also from the show. Can you talk to us about what you've been up to since you published the book?
Okay, the book was published in 2010. I was so fortunate to have the opportunity to write it, to be able to sort of make sense of this experience of incarceration and to think about how my own personal experience related to this much broader question of mass incarceration, all of the issues of race and class and gender that are present in this conversation today. And the Netflix adaptation of the book was released first in 2013, and that was a trip. And in 2015, I moved to Ohio from Brooklyn, which is where I'd lived for a long time. And I moved there to teach in one of the men's prisons, one of the men's state prisons, and the primary women's prison. Okay. There are 3 facilities that house women in the state of Ohio, but the main one holds, incarcerates 2,600 women. And so, so I've been there for about 3 years, working with a lot of students at this point. We've had about 30 students go through the program. The program is quite intensive. At this point, we began collaborating last year with a university in Ohio, which is conferring college credits to my students. And that's been a really fascinating experience as well, to sort of get the opportunity to work with both men and women on their personal narratives. They're writing personal narrative nonfiction. Many people would call it a memoir writing class. And their stories are, of course, tremendous. You know, they're astonishing, they're heartbreaking, they're hilarious, they're enraging sometimes. And people choose to write about what is most important to them. And the goal really of doing that work, and why I went to Ohio, was that we need far more stories to come out of certainly, you know, the correctional experience, but also the much broader experience of criminal justice system involvement, in order for us to really understand this sort of beast that we've constructed over just really 40 years with a long legacy of racial and class violence backing it up.
Yeah. So this question is for both of you, and you mentioned 2010, which is when the book came out. So we're almost a decade past. Yeah. I'm wondering, what changes do you think have happened in the criminal justice system, specifically when we talk about women who are incarcerated in the past decade? Topeka, I want to start with you.
Well, I would say that first, more women have been incarcerated. I've heard throughout the day that people have talked about that. But also, I want to lend my remarks, if I can, for a moment, to and dedicate them to Ramona Brandt, a sister of ours that just passed away this weekend. She received clemency from President Barack Obama, and about 2 years ago, and she served 21 years in prison for a first-time offense, nonviolent. And, you know, my heart is broken, but also I'm angry, because this didn't have to happen. She was a victim of abuse. She was a battered woman. And, you know, when I think about my experience of incarceration, it pales in comparison to her and the many women that are incarcerated. And when we think about the federal system, where both Piper and I were, they're incarcerated for life. And in federal prison, life means death. And when these laws are changing or new laws are introduced, there's no retroactivity, so people are still staying in prison. When if someone would have gotten arrested today for the same crime, they wouldn't have the same type of disgusting sentence. And so my heart is really heavy. Ramona is a brilliant, graceful woman, and she stepped out of prison and gave her life to fighting for the injustices of the system, and also for the sisters that she left behind. And it's just frustrating to know that from when the time she was incarcerated, and I believe it was 1994, my first year in college at the time, to her being released in 2015, or even when you said 2010, that much has not changed.
Right. Piper, do you see any big changes, or do you kind of agree with Topeka that kind of the baseline is the same?
When we look at the question of reforming the criminal justice system or transforming it, which might be perhaps better than reforming it, we have seen progress in areas like the juvenile justice system in terms of reducing the number of kids who are locked up in juvie prison, though, as the previous session revealed, things like racial disparity are even starker, right? Sometimes when we do reforms, we still don't address some of the most problematic and unacceptable injustices. So when it comes to women, though, in the system, I think, ironically, even though there's far more discussion of the situation for women and girls in the system, we have seen far less progress in terms of reducing the number. So, in many places in this country, the number of men who are being incarcerated has either been reduced or at least has flatlined a little bit, has plateaued. But in most places in this country, the incarceration for women continues to increase. So in Ohio, again, where I live, the incarceration rate for women keeps on going up, and many of those commitments are for very short sentences. So I always think that when we talk about women and girls in the system, those examples afford us a very ordinary, everyday example of this incredible commitment to punishment in this country. So when we talk about the death penalty, or when we talk about the fact that we're the only nation in the world that sentences children to die in prison, juvenile life without parole sentences, those are very harsh sentences, obviously, and they tend to attach to very serious crimes and serious acts of violence. But when we look at women and girls in the system, what we see is far too many women like Ramona who essentially have their lives stolen from them. I can't overemphasize that Ramona Brandt, who was a remarkable human being, just to meet her, briefly a few times, you're just like, wow, that's a spirit that we can all learn from. But her offense just wasn't that different than mine. She was involved in a relationship with someone who was involved with narcotics, just like I was. She had never been arrested or charged with a crime before, just like I was. And I received a 15-month sentence, and she received a life sentence. And, we have to look at why that is. And it's overwhelmingly about race, access to justice, access to counsel, but it's fundamentally very much about race. And these things have really not been transformed in the system. And so when we look at women and girls in the system, I'll just offer one more example. We have to get down to sort of the nitty-gritty and down to the ground, like where these sentences are happening. And so in Ohio, where I live, there's a small rural county, sort of in between, Columbus and Cleveland, Crawford County. And the corrections folks who I collaborate with to do my program told me, yeah, for years and years, they would send an average of 2 women into the system, right? They were sending an average of 2 women to prison, to state prison. And then a new judge was elected in that county, and he sent 62 women to prison, right? And it's this combination of the work, the actions of judges and the actions of prosecutors that are sending women into the system for drug offenses and for property crimes, and often for very low-level ones. And that has not stopped.
Topeka, I'm wondering if you can kind of go back and speak to something Piper just brought up, which is the discrepancy in sentencing that happens based on income, based on race. How have you seen that affect who winds up incarcerated, and how does that affect some of the work that you do?
Well, it definitely, as Piper brought up, and I think everyone knows, race is a driver of incarceration and mass incarceration as a whole. Same with women. Women have been kidnapped from the streets into this system, which is despairingly against people of color, communities of color. And so for me, and the work that I do, being a woman of color first and a formerly incarcerated woman, my drive is to help to make sure that women, one, have a platform such as these, that to use their voice, to make sure that we are making the recommendations for legislative change and are at the table. but also that we are leading the work and providing the resources that our sisters need when they come home, because we know what we need first, right? When I came home, there were other formerly incarcerated women that took me up under their wing and said, hey, this is what you should do, this is what you want to do, let me show you how to do it. It wasn't the systems that were in place. It was not probation and parole. It was not anyone who was surveillancing over us or our communities. And so I think that, you know, when we look at what's happening within this system, we also have to tie it into policing, right? And what's happening with policing and what's happening with criminalization of people of color. It's the same, it's directly tied in. And the only way that we can really dismantle this system, I mean, in a perfect world, we would love to transform it, right? But you cannot reform something that is in place, as people have said time and time again, in order to do exactly what it has done, disrupt communities of color and just break our families apart. And so for me, I think we need to just come to grips with it's about race, right? Look at where we've come from, look at where we want to go, and really put those things to implement new programs and new changes and new laws that'll take our people out of prison first, and then keep our people from going in.
Right. When we think about some of the legislation that is being pushed forward, when we think about some of the work that's being done on criminal justice reform, it always seems to be centered on men, obviously. I'm wondering if you guys think that specific legislation and specific programs need to be tailored towards women, formerly incarcerated women, to deal with some of the unique challenges they face, or is there sort of a trickle-down effect where as we change the system more broadly, it will also help women?
Well, right now, in my role as director for the Dignity Campaign for Cut 50, the formerly incarcerated women through the National Council had actually helped to draft this legislation that I believe Senator Booker has spoken about for the Dignity for Incarcerated Women Act. And Piper and I were talking about it earlier that, you know, it's just unfortunate that we actually have the right legislation to make sure that women have their basic hygiene needs met, right? It's terrible that we have the right legislation that would make sure that children are within a proximity to their parents so we don't have to continue to dismantle and break our family unit. However, we do. And so, you know, within that, you know, I just want to take a minute to say I heard earlier about human rights and us looking at this as humanity, and that we have to stop saying, you know, as I come into my political place in this world, you know, left and right and blue and red and all these other things, instead of looking at it from right and wrong. And how do we really make these changes to make sure that we, as women and as people within this country, are doing what's right by their people? And so, you know, the Dignity for Incarcerated Women Act, we believe in it because despite all of our work, most of our work wanting to decriminalize and decarcerate, that we remember where we were. And it's important while our sisters are waiting to come home that their basic needs are met.
Piper, I'm wondering if you agree with that. And also, you're working with both incarcerated men and incarcerated women. I'm wondering if you notice any differences in kind of the experience they're having and also in the stories that they're telling as you work with them.
I echo everything that Topeka said. It's sort of astonishing that we have to try to legislate some of the things that are in the Dignity Act, but the Dignity Act needs to be passed. Yes. And Topeka is also working at the state level because we have to hold state governments accountable as well. The federal government and federal legislation will only do certain things. We have to work on many fronts, and it's often observed there are really 3,000 criminal justice systems to contend with. Some of the other things that have gotten more attention and are gaining more steam and are having more proof points will definitely benefit women, like bail reform or the abolition of cash bail, right? So we know that the front end of the system has to be our focus, even as we try to make, you know, existing correctional facilities more, you know, humane and rehabilitative, and even as we work to make sure that people have safe return home and, you know, the opportunity to succeed. When I think about my students in both facilities, in the women's facility and in the men's facility, what you start to see is all of those factors, like, you know, bail and access to justice at the very beginning of contact with the criminal justice system. You start to see all of those issues around what is the safety that a person might return home to, and are they returning home to substance use disorder issues or a break in access to health care if they have mental health concerns or other chronic disease concerns. But what you really see overwhelmingly is this experience of trauma. And we know that the rates of trauma survival for incarcerated women and girls are 80 to 90%. They're astonishingly high. I would say, though, that after 3 years of teaching in a medium security men's facility, that my students' survival of trauma is also astonishingly high. And that is all of the same kinds of trauma that we often think about and talk about when we ask for gender responsive programming for women and girls. The men in my classes have also survived sexual violence and exposure to violence at a heartbreakingly young age. They interpret it differently because of gender. They think about it in really different terms, I think, than we do as women, because of some of these inequalities which are present in the community and which are even more dramatic and exacerbated in a place like a prison or a jail. Because a prison or a jail is a place that is built to be unequal. It is inherently hierarchical, dominance-oriented, and functions under the threat of violence. That's how a prison or a jail works, right? We put people in a prison or a jail, and one of the ways we keep them there is by the threat of violence. And so the idea that people who have survived violence that is tethered into those same inequalities will do well and prosper and get better and come home restored in a setting like that is very questionable. And also, if someone's offense is related to those kinds of hierarchies and inequalities, and I always feel like most violence stems directly from inequality, prisons and jails just reinforce all of those ideas and behaviors.
Right.
Yeah? So there's this fundamentally problematic idea of thinking that a prison or a jail can restore people and bring them home safe.
Yeah. I do want to let our audience know that we're going to save time for a couple questions at the end. So start thinking about them now, condense them all the way down, and also make sure they are questions. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about reentry, especially when we talk about women of color. I think when we think about reentry and the challenges there, we often think about men, black men, coming back to their communities and all the challenges they face trying to reinsert themselves. Topeka, can you talk to me about some of the unique needs that meet women when they are released, particularly women of color?
Absolutely. I mean, you think about having to reunify with families, getting the children back, who a lot of times have been broken up and all over the place, whether it be foster care or a parent or grandparent that could be somewhere, and they're not able to connect. You think about healthcare, right? How do we have affordable healthcare in this country, which we don't, and yet women of color, again, don't have access to these things. And then the issues that women of color, like uterine fibroids and different things that we go through, specifically, and being on home monitor, I'll give you a prime example of when I had the ankle shackle on, I call it a shackle, and I had uterine fibroids, and I had to have surgery, and I could not get a certain test done because the machine wouldn't allow me to go through with that on my ankle, and yet they would not remove it. And so by the time I was able to get off and actually have the test done, the fibroid actually went from 10 centimeters to 16. And so I had to have a full myomectomy when it could have been partial. And so it's these things that, again, and not having they may not have done it to someone else, right? But I know that they did it to me. And then thinking about access to education, access to different resources, access to being within spaces that actually give opportunity for job placement. When I was in Danbury, when I was thinking about gender responsive programming and things, they offered us for adult continuing education programming, knitting and crocheting for women. And how is that actually going to help a woman return and actually be marketable and have a skill set that's going to help them get a job to sustain themselves and get their family? And then housing, right? And being the number one thing that people need when they come home. And safe housing. In New York, they go to a shelter, which is typically debilitated. There's a lot of violence and things happening within there. New York, if you want to have your children back, and say you have a son and a daughter, they require you to have a 3-bedroom apartment. So I know how much I pay for a one-bedroom apartment in New York, and imagine just coming home thinking about getting your children back, right? And then these places don't even have enough beds to even house a woman. Most of them maybe could be 100 beds and 10 dedicated to women. And so what we did in New York was created Hope House, which is a safe housing space for women and girls. And even with our 5 rooms in the house for the women, we're having community pushback. So it's internalized racism within your community. You're coming back into the same communities that you left, and they're saying, this is great, but not in my backyard. So it's all of these different things that you have to face, right? And then just also having to worry about being under surveillance, having these random drug tests when maybe you don't even take drugs, having to continue to just be dehumanized and demoralized and just treated as if, you are still whatever the system felt that you were. Mm-hmm. And so I know, just again, from being a woman of color and actually having access to resources when I came home, that I was not treated any different. So I can only imagine the sisters that did not have that access and resources and how they have been treated, and it's why I do and we do the work that we do. I mean, when we have an opportunity, I know people want to know how they can help, and I know that there's organizations ran by sisters right here in DC, like The Wire and like Mission Launch, and make sure that you connect with these sisters here so you can help them to push their work forward.
Mm-hmm. I want to make sure. Sorry, go ahead.
I would only reinforce, especially that question about housing. I think Topeka covered so many of the things that face women coming home. We know there are some consistent shared challenges for men and women, but that housing question, is so significant for women. Because when you think about men being released from prison, often they have a mother, a sister, a girlfriend or a wife, or there's someone, generally a woman, who's going to offer them safe haven, and that is much less true for women returning home out of that system. And for women, I mean, safe housing is important for men, but men and women have different questions and considerations when it comes to being safe. And that's why Hope House is so important, and other work like that, Susan Burton's work in LA.
Absolutely.
It's
Who
a
we're modeled
really,
after, so.
really important point.
For sure.
All right, I want to make sure I give the audience a chance if you guys have any questions.
Annalise with Citizens United for Rehabilitation of Errants. One point I wanted to make about education, and this relates to the federal system. I think the USA attorney, or the assistant U.S. attorney earlier said that the federal system is doing basically well, really well. And but to point it out that there are 16,000 people on the waiting list in the Federal Bureau of Prisons for literacy programs. Right. So, how is it doing well? And for basic programs like that. And the other point I wanted to make is in touching on parents and locating these prisons in very remote rural areas. There's a prison right now that is slated, a federal prison, Congressman got a $500 million in. It's sitting there. The Trump administration says that the population has gone down for 4 years in a row. We don't need it. So it's a matter of resources.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Is there a question right here? Oh, sorry.
Hello, ladies. I am Tracy McKissick. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I'm a retired principal, and my girls fought worse than the boys, and my students were amazing, but the resources available for young girls in high school to deal with the assault, the violence in the home, the poverty that we dealt with, what would you think would be some of the things that could be done to help educators like myself, to help the young women? Because their families were, a lot of my kids, their families were, everybody had somebody in jail. Right. Or just come out of jail. Okay. Then it affected the family.
What can be done to help educators help kids?
Yes.
Well, I can just touch on that. There's a young sister named Kendia Riley, who both of her parents are incarcerated in the federal prison, and since she was 2 years old. And she talks about the fact that she would, she was upset, of course, right? Your parents are gone. And so she acted out in a way because, again, she didn't have access to these resources, which would help her with trauma. So she acted out. Yet what helped her was that there were educators who actually connected her with her parents. So I think that's what's important is if you can identify children or young girls, boys, whomever who has a parent who's incarcerated, that you make sure that they're able to connect, whether it be letter writing, whether it be email access, whether it be even maybe taking time to take them to see their parents.
Piper, did you have anything to add on that question?
I think that I echo your identification of the problem. My father, taught primary school and, taught 5th grade and was like, we always knew which kids were going, like the pathways were really, really clear and the resources were not there. You can observe that we fail to put the resources where they need to be. We need to put all the resources to keep a kid who is struggling in a traditional education setting in school, because we know that the minute a kid leaves the education system, their chances of going into the criminal justice system just went way, way up. All of these overlapping systems, foster care, the juvenile justice system, the school systems, function currently to funnel poor people and vastly disproportionately poor people of color into prisons and jails. And they are there to employ, people in rural areas where we have built up this incredible carceral state. So it's a formidable economic challenge, but we need to spend our money not building, edifices to, racism and punishment, and investing them in the communities that are most in need.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Topeka and Piper.
Thank you.